Africa Business News, proudly sponsored by EY.
Africa, it is huge, it is diverse, and its business landscape fascinating and dynamic. And that's our business here on your favorite weekly African business stop. I'm with Mhundwa here in Johannesburg.
That's right, Victor. We're also joined by Beatrice Gachenge in Nairobi. Mambo, Beatrice.
Poasana Christine.
And Didi Akinyelure is in Lagos. How are you doing, Didi?
I am very well, thank you.
And my name is Victor Kgomoeswana, and this is the Africa Business News. And coming up in today's show, President Mugabe of Zimbabwe turns to China for investment. Are the days of Ebola finally numbered, as reports out of China seem to suggest? And in East Africa, Africa's richest man has come out to visit. All these and more in today's edition of Africa Business News. First, we are off to East Africa. Well, Beatrice, the bad news out of Kenya this week was that inflation increased to 8.4% due to stronger food prices. But the good news, Kenya registered the highest growth Africa-wide in insurance for 2013.
Well, that's right, Victor. Kenya's insurance industry grew by 20.4% in 2013. And this is the highest growth rate in terms of percentage in Africa, and it's the second best in the world after Jordan. And to put that into perspective, Victor, South Africa's insurance industry, which is the best in the continent, grew by only 17%, while Jordan, on the other hand, had the highest growth rate of about 24% globally.
Beatrice, I believe tourism is now Uganda's new top export earner.
Well, that's right, Didi. Tourism for the first time has become Uganda's biggest export earner, and this is after it fetched about $1.4 billion in the financial year 2013-2014, and this was up from $1.1 billion a year before.
Beatrice, let's talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly on East Africa's nascent oil discoveries. Who's suing who, who's discovering what, and what's the way forward for East Africa?
Well, Christine, a lot is happening on the oil sector, from Somalia suing Kenya at the International Court in the Hague. And of course, they're seeking resolution on a long-running dispute over lucrative oil reserves in the Indian Ocean. And of course, it's the right on who owns the right to explore, and of course, who has to collect revenue. Somalia says that diplomatic negotiations on the maritime border issue has failed between the coastal nations, and this is the reason why they're seeking intervention at the United Nations highest court.
So that is definitely the ugly, Beatrice. And speaking of strained diplomatic relations, another big story that could get ugly is the Kenya-South Africa tit-for-tat visa requirement. But back to the oil story, the bad, I would imagine, is that the row could threaten exploration rights that Kenya has granted to oil and gas companies, which have already started exploring in the area. So what's the good news?
Well, Victor, talking of revenues, Kenya and neighboring Uganda are looking at increased oil production, and this was after Tullow Oil said that it plans to drill more wells over the next 2 years after good results in the northern part of Kenya. And of course, the success story of Tullow Oil and Africa Oil, it has encouraged many other explorers to do seismic studies and of course drilling of wells in search of the black gold, and on to Uganda, where they have discovered more oil. It is estimated that Uganda's petroleum resource base has doubled, with additional 3 billion barrels of oil in the Albertine region. And of course, Victor, these are the long-term projects, and of course revenues are not expected tomorrow, but the future certainly looks very promising for these nations.
Well, I like a success story. Who doesn't? Let's talk about the richest man in Africa, Aliko Dangote, and his cement business. Is not news that he's expanding into East Africa and invested over $1 billion in sub-Saharan Africa during the last fiscal year. CNBC Africa has covered that extensively, but the question is whether his plans are on course, Beatrice.
Well, it sounds like work is on course in Tanzania, where Dangote Cement plans to have a plant that will produce 3 million metric tons of cement per annum, and it is set for 2015, and work at the Mhundwa plant is on schedule. Now in Ethiopia, a 2.5 metric tons plant is underway, which the completion is set for this year, and still this year Zambia's 1.5 metric ton per annum plant in Dola is also underway. Now in Kenya, it looks very promising because Dangote announced that they are planning to review the initial plans to have a 1.5 metric ton, and now instead they want to double that capacity.
Asante sana Beatrice Gachenge out of Nairobi, Kenya. Our next stop is in Southern Africa, out here, where there are talks of a coup in Lesotho, which got me extremely worried. The last thing we need is a violent takeover of any government. President Jacob Zuma of South Africa and his Zimbabwean counterpart, President Robert Mugabe, have been out on the road a lot. President Zuma out in Russia and President Robert Mugabe in China, where I'm told he struck some mega deals to do with power, road and railroad construction. What do you make of these deals in China all of a sudden, Christy?
Well, Victor, we know that Zimbabwe is China's top investment destination in Africa. In fact, trade between the two nations reached over $1 billion last year. President Mugabe also hasn't been particularly subtle about the fact that he prefers Chinese investment to, of course, the West. So he went out looking for money and looks like he's brought home bags of it.
Look east, look east. Well, he keeps saying he's looking more east, away from the West, as his politics changes every day, President Mugabe. But it's encouraging to see that Zimbabwe is taking a more realistic stance on indigenization.
That's right, Victor. When it comes to this indigenization policy, it's not particularly clear who ought to comply and who not to, if you look at the sectors. But what we do know in the sectors where it is compulsory, not everybody's complying, like the banking sector. So without calling it an about turn on that particular piece of legislation, I'd like to perhaps propose that this is a softening in stance.
A softening instance indeed, because it's not very easy to raise capital on the markets if people don't know whether they'll be able to control the companies, because that's part of risk management. The Zimbabwean government, taking a softer stance on indigenization, has seen them abandoning what has been seen as a one-size-fits-all approach, compelling players in the financial services sector to sell controlling stakes to locals. What's your take on this? Do you believe we could expect the government to be more flexible in the other sectors of the economy on this indigenization as well?
Certainly. I mean, like you said, Victor, we need foreign direct investment in Zimbabwe, and this policy is proving to be a challenge regarding that. And so we are going to see a lot more flexibility. The tone coming from the ministers, the tone coming from the central bank governor, we can also expect that it is the same tone coming from the president.
All investors are asking for is for certainty. What do we have to do and by when and how much? But in Zambia, we hear that the volume of the country's bilateral trade with India has soared to $619 million in 2014, from $568 million recorded in the previous year. This is according to the information obtained from the Indian High Commission in Lusaka. India's major items of exports to Zambia during the period were pharmaceuticals and fine chemicals, machinery and instruments, transport equipment, metals and electronic goods. On the other hand, Zambia exported to India during the last year mainly non-ferrous metals, pearls, precious and semi-precious stones, cotton, raw and metalliferous ores and metal scrap. Christine, same old story, isn't it? You export raw minerals to India, they export finished goods to you. Is Africa ever going to get this beneficiation story right?
Well, that remains to be seen, Victor, but we do know that the Zambian government is looking closely at this sector as a key sector to the country's economy. Unfortunately, the developments are that the sector's contribution to the country's GDP has declined. But we know that that's because of cheap imports coming from the likes of China and India. And we also know that there aren't a lot of incentives for local players in the sector. But government says it's looking closely at this, and perhaps we'll see more manufacturing, because at the moment, Zambia is importing everything from agricultural products to plastic.
As an African, I'm just tired of exporting minerals out and importing them at a higher price because they've just been processed. But anyway, the Ebola story continues to hog the limelight in African economic and business news. South African Health Minister urging only essential travel to and from the three countries worst hit by the disease, being Sierra Leone, Guinea and Liberia. But there might be a breakthrough if we go by what I'm hearing coming out of China. Well, Didi, the tussle is still between Nigeria and Liberia over the latter's approval of travel by Patrick Sawyer to Nigeria as the death toll rises in West Africa. But China approves its first anti-Ebola drug.
That's right, Victor. China has cleared its first drug called JK05 for the treatment of Ebola to be used by its army. Now, so far, the drug has only been cleared for use in emergency situations.
Didi, what's the update on the Ebola situation in Rivers State?
Well, here's what we know. 3 people out of 50 classified as high-risk primary contacts of the doctor who died in Port Harcourt have been quarantined as in-house patients at the Ebola isolation unit. Now, apparently, those 3 people have shown symptoms of the virus. There are also 150 people who have been classified as secondary contacts. Those people are currently under surveillance. Now, what is shocking is that there are apparently 60 people who who have not been traced. These 60 people had secondary contact with the late doctor. So it's clear that some people are reluctant to present themselves to the Rivers State government's medical team because of the stigma associated with the disease.
Well, I'm not surprised Sierra Leone has made it a crime to not disclose this, but let's not forget that the virus has still not been eradicated in Lagos State. But would you say that things are pretty much under control in Lagos now, Didi? What's the general mood in the state like?
The virus has been contained, but as you mentioned, not eradicated in Lagos State. Right now, there are 2 people, primary contacts of the index case, still infected with the Ebola virus in Lagos State. However, we also know that the wife of the deceased doctor who died in Port Harcourt is suspected to have the disease, and she has been moved to the Ebola isolation center in Lagos.
Didi, taking you back to Aliko Dangote, and of course I know you've been tracking the performance of his company, and since he announced that he wants to expand into Africa, how is the share price performance of the cement business?
Well, Dangote Cement has only gained 5.53% this year, though the stock has outperformed the all-share index, which is only up 0.5% so far this year. The company recently released half-year earnings showing earnings per share for the 6 months down 11% year-on-year. Profit for the period was weighed down by higher energy costs as cost of sales rose. I think it's safe to say that the share price is reacting more to the activity we are seeing in the Dangote Cement business in West Africa and not so much outside these parts. However, news of the company's expansion to 15 other countries is likely to be positive in the long run.
Well, I can only say, Mama, there go that man Dangote. Finally, Didi, Nigeria rolled out a biometric-based verification card. Tell me about that.
Yes, Nigeria's President Goodluck Jonathan received his national EID card this week, signifying the official launch of the EID pilot program. Now, in the pilot phase, the Nigerian Identity Management Commission will issue the identity cards to 13 million Nigerians. The card can also perform electronic payments.
Well, that was Didi Akinyelure in Lagos giving us the West African business headlines of the past week. Before we check out, I ask you, Christine, Beatrice and Didi, if you know about the multinational corporation formed on this day, September 2nd, in 1929. It has since grown to be a major player on the African continent. Beatrice, I would be very surprised if you don't know this one.
Well, Victor, I think the answer that you're looking for is Unilever.
Right on the money, Beatrice. Gachenge, consumer goods conglomerate headquartered in Rotterdam and London, was created on September 2nd when British soap manufacturer merged its operations with those of margarine producer from the Netherlands, Margarine Unie. The rationale at the time was to improve the efficiency of sourcing palm oil from West Africa, palm oil, of course, being a major ingredient of both margarine and soap. Since then, of course, the company has expanded to the rest of the world, starting with Africa and Latin America in the 1930s. Which puts an end to our show this week. Stay tuned to CNBC Africa. We're back with you next week with more stories out of the African continent. Until then, kwaherini mabibi na mabwana. Cheers.